So now it has, I think, in some people's minds, become a question. In some people's minds, it's been answered, but I want to raise it again because I think that, to some extent, developers like myself, people doing SQL and PL SQL on the back end, hidden away, do not, perhaps no longer fully appreciate the role they do play and the importance of the role they do play. And that's one of the things I want to talk about and get across today, of why people working inside the database and working with the database directly are so crucial to everything going on in human civilization.
Absolutely. And it's definitely, like you're saying, changed over the last 20 years. You know, data is very important. Where do you have data? In the databases. Mm-hmm. So, you know, how has this really impacted those developers, and how has that really changed what they're trying to do?
Yeah, so things have changed an awful lot, and I'm going to sort of slide around to my slides here. Whoops. Whoops. That's the one I want to show.
Really sliding.
So, you know, I think when I joined Oracle back in 2014, so I was away for 22 years, and then I rejoined Oracle. And when I was asked to lead a team to help kind of energize the community, get people more engaged, and make sure that new developers coming into out of university and learning JavaScript and so on in university also appreciated what databases have to offer, Oracle databases and non-Oracle databases, and especially relational technology. And it forced me to step back and think. So what is the big deal? Why is this so important? And how have things changed? Why, again, is this even a question? And one of the conclusions I came to is that one of the big shifts that have taken place in the last 20 years is what it means to be a user. So when I joined Oracle, when I started working with computers back in the late 80s, and for a long time after that, the user was a corporate employee. People in general didn't go out using software. They still lived in the real world a lot more than people do today, and there's a lot to be said for that. Yeah. But primarily, we wrote applications for employees of companies. That means a few things. One is that the company can say, I don't care if you don't like the user interface. You're using this application. We pay people to build it. You're using it. And then there are lots of other aspects around the level of, probably in general, education about how to use computers. Training, in other words, would be available to the users to learn how to use these systems. Now we have this incredible fundamental shift around computing, which has to do with putting software in the hands of everybody. And essentially now the definition of a user is not a corporate employee, it's a consumer. And once the consumer becomes the primary user of software, oh my God, everything changes. Everything changes in so many ways. First of all, one of the interesting things that I don't think we think about too much is in terms of the user interface. The user interfaces people deal with now on mobile, iPad, and whatever are much simpler than they used to be. Partly that's because of the nature of the device, partly because of the people interacting with them don't want to deal with a lot of complexity. But also, I think that user interfaces have always been the major point of contact with users on a cultural level. So if you think about designing a database well and designing a user interface well, the database design is absolutely critical, but it's our stuff inside the system. When you're talking about designing a user interface, first and foremost, you're talking about interacting with humans in their current cultural context. And culture changes dramatically and quickly and faster and faster. So that means the demands, now coming back to how things have really changed, the demands on user interface and the pace of change for user interface just keeps going faster and faster. And that forces changes in application development. Right? So the need to be able to build things quickly and move them out quickly has really changed things.
So do you think this actually shifts more away from the database development because you're focused on that user interface? Or how is this shift happening?
Well, I think that's exactly part of what has caused the database to recede from people's view. I mean, database, was never really in people's views. Even as corporate employees, they knew there was a database. They knew that this information was going somewhere if they thought about it. It never really mattered in a sense. But it still mattered a lot to the database developers, to the developers writing the apps. Now the application developers are so focused on that top layer of interface development and really don't think about the database. It's a total secondary concept for them. And so, and some of the technologies and some of the dynamics of data actually kind of encourage that, because the funny thing is that there's a real tendency among ourselves, our database developers, DBAs and so forth, to really laugh at modern application developers. And this whole idea of eventually consistent data. Eventually your transaction will get there and maybe we'll lose some of your data, but it doesn't really matter. And we just say, that's ridiculous. That's not a real database. Well, the fact is that user data is critical in the aggregate. It turns out to not be so critical on a transactional basis. If you lose a tweet, if you lose a post on your Facebook page, it actually doesn't really matter. It's irritating, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect your bank account and so on. So we look at that and we laugh. And we say, oh, that's just kind of silly. But it's obviously not silly. It's a different way of dealing with data. The data that is being consumed, that people are generating as consumers, besides the critical transactional data, the purchasing of software, purchasing of products, in which case you can't afford to lose anything. And they're still running on Oracle and whatever other relational database down there. But all this other stuff, it's fluff because what they're doing is leveraging that data, essentially, for advertising purposes. When it comes right down to it, right? It's all about this loop, and I don't think it's a virtuous loop of grabbing data in the aggregate, so we don't care about the incremental pieces of data, and then using it to feed back advertising to pull people into that next consumption step.
That's true, and I know, I'm very careful about what I'm entering out there as well, and the data that's being collected, and I know my daughters are too. But even what you're talking about, if it's data that's being used for those types, why even have SQL around? Why even have that? And isn't it more of a has-been technology? I know differently, but I'd like to hear your opinion on that too.
No, SQL is a has-been technology. No. Well,
we'd be in real trouble if it was.
I don't know about you, but I know I would be. Yeah, I'm just a few steps away in the organizational chart from the guy who owns Oracle Database. So yes, SQL is a very important technology, and in fact, it obviously really is. So on the one hand, new developers tend to be disdainful of SQL because it's been around for like 35, 36 years now. And in general, in the world of software, they talk about the only industry that's more fashion conscious than the fashion industry is the software industry. It's always got to be something new and something great. It's sort of inherent in where the leading edge technology, where the defining of leading edge technology in terms of software and hardware. It's all high technology. Anyway, so in general, you look at something that's been around for more than a few years, especially if you're a JavaScript developer, more than like 3 months, and you think to yourself, well, this can't be any good. Surely there's something better now. But in fact, SQL has, if anything, gained more and more power in recent years. Now, so to go back to why this is even a question, there was no doubt that with the advent of big data, with this generation of enormous volumes of data, and not the need for the ACID transaction integrity that you get with a relational database, the relational database technologies weren't a good fit. And even today, Oracle Database is not a good fit for some use cases. But here's the funny thing. They are the most extreme use cases. Okay, so Facebook, I'm sure, uses Oracle, but they use some of their own technologies, their own databases, have created new database technologies for the very extreme cases. There are very few companies who have the needs of a Facebook. But I guess everybody wants to be a Facebook eventually, so I better not use that database technology that Facebook doesn't use. But it's kind of silly. So if you look at the broad range of use cases of all the applications being built, probably 95% of them not only run fine on an Oracle database or similar relational technology, but better. But people are being steered away from that pretty much as a fad. And I don't think it's doing them much good, and I don't think it's doing much of a service to their customers as well, partly because we guys who've been around, guys and gals who've been around for years, we know that if you move too fast, if you don't figure out your database design effectively, then you can end up with a mess, not necessarily today, but tomorrow and the next day. But probably if you talk to most 20-year-old, 25-year-old developers and you say, got to think about tomorrow, they're like, tomorrow? What's that? We live in the now. Let's get it done now. And there's a lot to be said for that, but it has its drawbacks. So SQL is certainly old, but it's not tired. It's not worn out. In fact, there's still a lot of innovation. And there was this whole movement called NoSQL. There are NoSQL databases, NoSQL. And really what it means is not only SQL, instead of get rid of SQL and replace it with something else. And I think it was one of those situations where, once the NoSQL idea came out and it got that unfortunate name, there was a kind of piling on of, yeah, Oracle, you're no good anymore. Look, SQL's no good anymore. There's NoSQL. That's better. And after a while, people started to realize, oh my gosh, you know what? SQL's really good. I mean, I might need an Hadoop MapReduce database at some point, but if I need to build applications on top of that data in some sort of real-time way, develop them, manipulate the data, it doesn't cut it. And so now people are going to new SQL. That's the new thing, new SQL, and adding some new features to that. And Oracle's like, yeah, well, we've got new SQL. We keep adding JSON and all sorts of features to the SQL database to make it more and more powerful to meet the new needs.
So the question is, why is SQL better than a not only SQL?
Right.
Or a new SQL type.
Well, really what it comes down to, one of the things that Tom Kite said a couple of years ago when he was at a Yes SQL event that we organized at Oracle Open World 2014,
yes. I was
is
there.
that, great, the whole point of SQL was to supplant the NoSQL databases. So people were using databases, and they had lots of pointers and lots of refs and lots of code to manipulate data. And SQL was an answer to that. Basically, we were reaching limitations as what could be done and how quickly it could be done. How quickly we can meet the, at that point, accelerating need for applications and data management. And SQL came out of that movement. And the whole point of SQL, and it's something that I think people don't, it's hard to remember. The fundamental power of SQL is that you don't write programs when you're writing a SQL statement. You're describing the set of data you want or that you want to change. And the underlying engine does the work for you. It's a declarative set-oriented language. And that piece is often cast aside. People, especially if you don't learn about that way of thinking in university, say, and you're instead steered towards procedural languages, object-oriented languages, etc., you don't pick up on the power of set-oriented thinking. And it's a real sad thing, I think, in a number of ways, partly because, and I'll bring it again back to why SQL is so powerful, not only is set-oriented declarative processing a better way to think and to write code, but I think it just also more naturally fits with how we see the world. And that, I think, is fundamentally why SQL is still around, and SQL, in a way, is regaining strength in recent years, because we can't figure out anything that's better in terms of how to manipulate data. So let me dive into that in a little bit more detail, if you don't mind.
That would be great.
Because one of the other things I've been doing over the last few years is reading a lot about evolution. A lot of people say they believe in evolution. A lot of people say they don't. But even among the people who say they believe in it, I think a lot of us just take it for granted. We have this very superficial, high-level understanding of what it means, and I'm not going to go into great detail about that now. Maybe on a different webcast from IOUG.
I'm sure we would debate that actually pretty well.
On evolution? Okay. But I think it's, so if you look at how we evolved over many years, it's pretty clear that what our brain does, and all brains that I know of, is we've developed different kind of senses to ingest data. We take in visual data, we take in oral data, we take in smells, taste, et cetera, et cetera. And our brain takes all that data as bits and bytes, pretty much literally, and it identifies patterns, and it uses that pattern analysis to predict how to live in the world so that it can survive and thrive and reproduce. So that's how we evolved over millions of years to act. And then the question will be then, well, how does our brain deal with that data? How does it work with it? And I think, and so what you see on the page here, the slide deck, is a refiguring of what I call the technology stack. So we talk about stacks a lot in software, and it's always, we start at the network, the database, the network, UI, et cetera, et cetera. But when you come right down to it, applications are all about how allowing us to more effectively change the world. That's what humans have been doing since we first figured out how to pick up a stick and hit something with it. Started building tools, and we just build more and more and more sophisticated tools. But it all comes down to ingesting data from the world, deciding on patterns of activity that will help us master the world or get ahead in the world. So that's what this circle is all about. So if you look at how we accept data, and it just all starts with data. I think it was funny, there was this T-shirt, I think, from, who was it? Pythian came up with "Data is the new bacon," and I liked it. It was very catchy. Again, if you eat pork and you like bacon and stuff like that, assuming you do. But to me, it was
bacon's good with anything, right?
Good with anything, right? But to me, it was a real misnomer. Data has always been the bacon.
That's true.
It has always been the fundamental starting point for humans. Forget about machines and computers. If you don't have ingestion of data, you cannot figure out how to live in the world, how to survive, how to reproduce. And so if you then look at how we deal with data, it's very, very interesting, I think. So, and I like to compare this to, I'll just go right to this page, with object orientation. So, there was this big fight for a while when I was relatively new to Oracle and into the succeeding years, object-oriented databases versus SQL databases. And object-oriented program, I think, is pretty well taken hold as a major paradigm in a lot of languages. But that's different from necessarily dealing with data as object orientation. So, and I think it's a really great thing to compare object orientation and SQL as a way of looking at data. So I'm sure you all remember from your years in university and studying philosophy the Platonic ideal, Platonic theory. Sure you do, yes. Of course you do. So the idea in Plato's theory is that this world is not the real thing. There are these ideals that exist out there in the abstract somewhere. There is a perfect tree. There is the ideal human. And we are all imperfect variations on that thing. And I realized that's just what object orientation is. You have these classes that define the ideal. And then you have subclasses off of them that modify them in some way, and the actual instances of the object, all variations on that ideal. Well, that's very interesting, but when I look at the world, I don't see it in a Platonic way. Like when I go out and take a walk in the woods, I don't look at that tree and say, oh, that's such an interesting tree. It varies from the ideal in the following ways. No, I look at this big tree, this small tree, this bush, and I generate patterns. And I say, they're all green, they all have leaves, they all do this, they all do that. This is a tree. In other words, I think that humans think very naturally in sets. We do set-oriented, pattern-based thinking. And that is, I think, now coming all the way back to your question, sometimes I remember
we eventually get there, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's why SQL is still around, because I think that SQL reflects the way we think about the world. It is the most natural way for us to deal with data. And because of that, we can't escape it. I mean, people try to escape SQL and essentially end up writing a lot of code, and they're like, oh my God, I can't deal with all this code. Oh, you could just write a select statement with an order by, with an analytics clause, and boom, hundreds of lines of code down to 20, 30 lines of SQL in some cases. So I think that is the fundamental staying power of SQL, that it reflects the way that humans, the way our brains actually work in the world. And until our brains change, and they're not likely to change anytime soon in this sense, I think that we may never find a better data manipulation language than SQL, which is, I think, pretty exciting. It's a major milestone that we could come up with that. Just like it was a major milestone to discover DNA and be able to do genetic programming with that. Is much scarier than SQL. So yeah, so to me, and just to finish up that point, I think that data is very different from processing of data, writing code. So the procedural logic or object-oriented logic, whatever you want to talk about, is different from data. Data is just there. And it would make sense to me that since data is so different from programming, that it would make sense to have a special language that is aware of and reflects the way data is as that layer around it. So that's why I think people have tried to get away from this intermediate language. There's data. You have to use SQL to get data in the database, but you could just read rows and write rows and do all your work in the program. And that's what I think a lot of JavaScript developers do, a lot of these new open source scripting language developers do. They dismiss the database. They put all their logic into the user interface code, essentially. And then they're stuck doing a lot of that manipulation themselves because it doesn't lend itself. Those languages don't lend themselves to data management, to data manipulation.
And there's definitely a lot of power in the database to actually program this and to actually do this in the database side of things. And when you're pulling the sets of data, you can actually look at it as a whole instead of one row at a time and doing that. An interesting thought, about partnering with some of these developers. You have people that go out there and write Python and Ruby and some of these new open source
newfangled languages.
They're not bad, but
yeah, they're all great. Obviously, they do something.
But what can you imagine if they actually paired up with a database programmer, and how do you think that would help?
I think that's a really good point. So part of the mandate of my team, the Oracle Developer Advocates, is to make people more aware of how the Oracle database is not just for data manipulation, but as an actual platform for being able to build sustainable, secure, highly maintainable applications on top of Oracle database. I'm not saying you do everything inside the database. You still do want to write your JavaScript or your Ruby or your Python or your PHP or whatever those languages might be. But if you don't leverage all the stuff built into the database, not just SQL and PL SQL, but Oracle Text, Oracle Spatial, the list goes on and on, you end up doing a lot of extra work. But the counter argument will generally be, well, but I don't know how to learn that stuff. I don't want to learn that stuff, and don't bother me. I can get it done eventually inside my app. Well, there are two things I want to say about that. The first thing is, just two. There's been, for years, people would raise concerns about getting database lock-in. If you use PL SQL, then you're going to get stuck with Oracle. Don't use any Oracle SQL extensions. Use ANSI standard SQL only, because otherwise it'll be hard to switch databases later. Now, obviously, sometimes companies do switch database technologies, but I have a feeling that it's slightly more rare than changing the user interface language technologies. So I bet if most developers who have been around for more than 10 years were asked, how many times have your companies changed database versus How many times have your companies changed the user interface language? I don't think there's much data as to where it would fall. User interfaces, because they interface with culture, because culture is constantly churning, is forcing change in that user interface technology. So the point I wanted to make there is that that is exactly the reason that you want to move as much logic as you can out of the UI and out of the UI languages into the back end, because that's unlikely to change. And if you have a really strong API in the database, mostly surfaced up through PL SQL packages, and the UI developers are mostly accessing those API elements, maybe through REST or through direct calls, embedded calls, then if they say, oh, we're not doing Python now, JavaScript is the way to go, then all they're going to do is unhook their APIs, the calls to those APIs, and they're going to hook them up to the new language. And a lot of the work will be perfectly valid for the years to come. So that's one reason that I think you do want to have development happening in the database. Now, what do you do about that? It's hard to get, let's say, a 20-something, a young developer who just came out of college and they're all excited about JavaScript and they've never heard anything but bad stuff about SQL, to be told, well, you're going to have to learn SQL now. They'll probably just find someplace else to work. Well, now, I don't think that's a smart thing to do, but that's probably the reality.
Those talents, right?
So I think your point is really, really well taken. What would make sense to me if I were the manager of the development team and I was running on an Oracle database or a relational database is to have one person on my team, or maybe a couple, depending on the scale of the application, be the go-to person for the back-end technologies. In other words, in general, the JavaScript folks and the Python folks, they wouldn't write SQL or PL SQL. They would take a service-oriented architecture approach. They would say, hey, Joe, hey, I need a query that will do X, Y, Z. I need a call to a procedure that will do the following things. Can you do that for me, please? And they will be able to turn those around really fast, because when you get right down to it, writing PL SQL is not hard. It's a very straightforward language, which is why I think they should try it.
Don't tell too many people that.
No, I want people to know it. PL SQL is dead simple compared to JavaScript and Java and C and almost anything you name, because it's a special purpose language.
Sure.
But that makes a lot of sense to me then. The front-end developers focus on what they do great at and are excited about. You have a separate group of people who focus on that back-end servicing up the data in ways that they know are well-designed and performant. It seems like a really strong win-win all around.
Absolutely, and I think even some of the development with pairing gives both sides opportunities to learn from the other, right?
Right.
When you're pairing, someone's normally driving and writing the script, so if someone's doing their Python script, they could be doing that, and the database developer can be sitting there actually learning some of that code, and then they switch spots where, oh, I need that query. He's right there to actually type in that query and do it, and so you got pairing going on.
My God, you're a pair programming person.
Oh, I know,
wow.
It's scary,
That's
huh?
really
I'm sorry. Yeah. I believe you can do pair programming with databases as well. It doesn't just have to be the new.
For sure.
The new
That's
stuff.
an interesting idea. So pairing up, literally pairing up a back-end person and a front-end person together, and then you get some information sharing back and forth, knowledge transfer. Nice.
Good. Anyhow, going back to, I guess, our data and our SQL, though, right? Some other things that we get advantages out of actually having the data in the SQL. Your slides, I was just pointing out the integrity and consistency. We talked about that a little bit.
Well, I think it's worth reflecting on, especially because security is becoming obviously bigger and bigger and bigger issue. Oh my gosh! And of course, that's your specialty. And as you probably noticed at Oracle Open World 2015, Larry made a big deal out of that.
Yeah.
Security, and of course that means because we have a really good security solution. And it looks like we have some massive things coming along where you just have your entire enterprise encrypted at no cost to performance, right, built into the chip. That's pretty exciting, and it's obviously necessary. So in general, I think you probably heard of the Peters principle, that people get promoted above their level of competency, and so large organizations have increasing levels of incompetency and inefficiencies by essentially promoting by merit. It's an interesting concept. I think that humans follow the Peter principle on a global level. We have developed the ability to do things without the responsibility and maturity and wisdom to apply them properly. So if we can do it, let's do it, no matter what the costs are generally, and the costs are usually often very dramatic. So security, that's right.
Yes, security.
So, all these different websites are getting hacked. The most popular password is still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. So I think security is actually key. And here's the interesting thing. So if you're using Oracle Database, you have to use SQL, and we want to make sure that people keep using Oracle Database for all the reasons we've talked about. But then the question is, should you just let, for example, JavaScript developers execute SQL directly, more or less, or Java put in JDBC code and execute SQL? And the answer generally is no. So you were telling me before we started the call that there are still so many problems around cross-site scripting and SQL injection.
Yep.
So developers don't protect their websites properly, don't protect their apps properly. Well, the interesting thing is that you use SQL, and you have to use SQL, great. Then the question is what's put on top of that. And I'd say that if you actually care about security, if you care about performance, if you care about writing an application today that might be around a few years from now and need to be maintained, then the next step you should take is incorporating PL SQL into your technology stack. And the reason for that is simple. With PL SQL, you can actually create a secure layer around your database. And it happens to be the unique nature of PL SQL embedded in the database, tightly tied to SQL, sharing the same security profile essentially as SQL in the database, means that I could literally guarantee that nobody can violate the rules in the database, that nobody could put in bad data, get the wrong data out, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, it's interesting to contemplate that you'd like to say, well, we really should secure our application. It's going to be very hard, and we have to teach all our JavaScript developers this and that. Or you could say, you know what? It's actually literally possible today, if I have an Oracle database, to build a PL SQL API around that, making sure your data is in one schema, your code's in a separate schema, nobody ever connects to the data schema, and literally guarantee security and data integrity. Seems like a rather compelling argument. I've got to try that PL SQL. It sounds like good stuff. So I think that completes the picture from the back-end side. But you have to use SQL to get to the database, and you want to make the most use of SQL because there's so much packed into it, just looking at analytics and what you can accomplish with analytics. Then if you want to make sure that you secure the data, there's nothing inherently in the SQL language that has to do with security besides the roles and privileges you set up. That's where you need the PL SQL layer on top of that to make sure that you can safely essentially deliver data to the user interface developers. I think in fact I go back to that here. You can safely deliver the data out, and when those front-end applications are trying to change the database, if they go through the API can make sure that the right things are being done and only the right things.
Yeah, and that sounds like it will actually help a lot of those developers on the Java side, and because they're just calling the APIs, they're using the code that is there in the database, they've got the security around it, and
it does seem like a really compelling story. I know.
It does. So, you know, how do we help our bosses, our companies, you know, some of our new development friends that we found and partnering with know that this is a pretty good way to go?
Well, my strategy roughly is that we need to make our own user community more successful with our technology. And I'm sure it's got to be the same in any technology. If you look at Java, JavaScript, et cetera, most of the people using the technology just kind of dip their toe into it, get just enough out of it to do what they need to do and never go beyond. And that's really, without doubt, an issue with the Oracle database and utilizing SQL and PL SQL. The PL SQL side so much, but definitely in SQL. There's so much in the SQL language, and there's so much that's been built into it over the years, but most developers don't catch up and are not given the time to really go deep. Analytics is a great example. So that's the technology in analytics has been around for at least 10 years, and most people still don't utilize analytics. And I confess, I don't really. I'm quite old school. I know PL SQL pretty well, but I haven't even kept up on the SQL features. But I have guys on my team who do.
Well, that's the important part.
That's right. As long as there's somebody.
Smarter people.
Smarter people all around me. That's right. That's what a good manager does, right? Make sure that all the people working for you are smarter and better than you.
Absolutely.
So what we're focusing on in my team of advocates, of evangelists, are building better resources. So for example, Connor McDonald, who's one of the guys who's taken over for Tom and Ask Tom, Connor McDonald and Chris Saxon. He's building a new series of videos called KISS, Keep It Simple with SQL. And
oh, great. I wasn't trying to call people, you know, with SQL.
And the whole idea, you know, his attitude is analytics isn't complicated. Analytics makes things simpler and easier. We have, I think, a part of the dynamic you get with a mature technology like SQL and probably any language is that as you add more and more features, people perceive them as being advanced because they're layered on top of the core set of functionality. But sometimes those features, I mean, they're more advanced because they're newer. They're not more advanced than that they're necessarily all that much harder to understand. You just have to get in there and do it. So our focus is to provide resources, videos, blogs, Live SQL, which is a website you can go to where you can run any scripts that you want and try out SQL and PL SQL and run community scripts. We'll make it easier for them to come up to speed on these technologies, get them more excited and more successful, and then they will be the ones who can evangelize and promote these solutions, these blended solutions, as you were talking about before, to their teammates. So, as an Oracle person, I don't have a lot of credibility when I go out to, say, an open source environment where people are, less than enamored of Oracle over the years, and, try to make a convincing argument. I'll still do it, and I'm sure I will convince many, many people. But their coworkers are much more likely to do that.
True.
So if they can say, look at what I just did, look at how I've been able to improve the performance. You were complaining about this report last week. Now it's like 100 times faster. And they use this great feature, and look, we can use it here and here and here. Those are the kind of arguments that happen on a one-to-one basis over and over and over again that I think will probably have more of an impact on how this technology is successfully utilized and how successful the applications built on them are, compared to us just going out and saying, hey, we're the best, we're the greatest, come look at us. Which is why my granddaughter, I have a 4-year-old granddaughter, and she's got this thing about being the best. She's the best at everything. I'm the best at ice skating. You've never ice skated. I can read, I can write. Really? Well, show me what you can read. Well, I can't find that book now. You can get into this attitude where you're just the best, and you think people should believe you, but it doesn't work that way. Right? But, we are the best.
But you look at it from that perspective too, that you have this smaller viewpoint of the world. And as you start to look around, like you said, there's ways here to demonstrate and show and and see other things. And you start to go, hey, it may not be the best, but it's best for this, or
well, that's it. I think one of the themes that we're promoting also, and it would seem obvious on the face of it, is the right tool for the right job. I mean, JavaScript was designed for certain things, and it's an amazing language. The little bits that I know about it, quite amazing. It's amazing what people have done with it. Lots of technology is totally amazing. In fact, it's all amazing, but everything has its strengths and its weaknesses. Some languages like Java, you could say they're all-purpose programming languages. You can do anything and everything you want of them, and some people probably can. Most people stumble around and get lost, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the endpoint, which is delivering applications successfully to the users, then the most important thing is to look at the full array of features needed, the full array of technologies that need to be brought to bear, and what tools make the most sense under those circumstances. So you could push through with JavaScript, writing it all in JavaScript, writing it all in Java, writing it all in assembly language, actually, for that matter. Why not? But nobody would do that, right? And so I think the message to a lot of the young developers coming out is, you've got a lot of exciting stuff there, but it doesn't mean that it's the best and the most exciting for every single part of what you need to do. And so being aware of these other pieces and how they can play and how they can help will make you more successful.
So since you brought up pieces, and we know that you've been a PL SQL programmer for a very long time. And I've been a database administrator for a very long time, and I know there's always this wonderful love-hate relationship between DBAs and developers. We obviously talked about other developers and how they get along, but what do you think this means for our relationship, our DBA and developer relationship? It's also, the database is a big piece now, and the data that's coming out of it, how is that going to change as this, as these applications are changing here?
Well, I think probably the bigger question is not so much how the relationship between, say, back-end database developers and the administrators change. I'll come back to that one. It's more, I think the bigger issue is what's going to happen with database administrators. I know, but
say things like
I don't think I'm saying things that database administrators don't think about. Well, just think about the move to the cloud. It may not mean that there will be fewer jobs. It may mean that the jobs will be shifting.
Over by the cloud companies, right?
Well, pretty much, right? I mean, I think we can expect that in 10 or 20 years, a lot of businesses will no longer have their own data centers, will no longer have their own administrators. It will just push to the cloud, and they'll say, I need something done, and go do it. So there may be that a lot of developers end up working for cloud providers and provide essentially, I could see, for example, a consolidation happening around the remote DBA service.
Sure.
So many companies like Pythian have built large businesses around this, and it's a great model. That may get consolidated along with the cloud consolidation happening, or the cloud transfer, at least for Oracle, happening. So I think administrators probably see the biggest potential shifts coming in their jobs and how they might work, where they might work, and stuff like that.
Might be why I'm focusing on security now, Steven.
Very strategic. Sounds good. Certainly, I mean, I would say, every PL SQL developer should learn some Java, should learn some HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and I imagine every database administrator is just doing like core operational
data integrations, analytics, security. Those are all great things too, right?
Lots to learn. Now, in terms of administrators and developers, I think probably one of the biggest things that are changing there are the so-called DevOps. scenario, where you don't have these big walls that have, you have your developer DBAs, your operational DBAs, your developers plugging in different ways all the way along that cycle. It's a much more integrated flow of processing and engagement on teams. So I think I would expect that administrators would be more engaged in the ongoing work of supporting and building applications and putting in those pieces so that you can have this continuous process, the continuous flow, which might affect database developers as much as administrators. But putting all of that aside for a second, for many years to come, a lot of us will still be working in a fairly traditional environment. I think that if you're in your, probably even in your 40s, and you're a back-end developer in at least a large company, you could probably work the rest of your career in that same kind of environment, especially if you're good at what you do and don't need to find a new job. So the bottom line there is that we still have the same old challenge, which is how do administrators and developers get along? And so my advice for developers is don't get into a fight with your DBA. You generally can't win.
Very wise advice.
Well, they have more authority, more responsibility, they're probably paid more. You don't want to go to battle with a DBA. And the other thing about it is that unless your DBA's got a problem, when DBAs aren't smart or they're ignorant about their database, that's a really, really big problem. I could share an awful anecdote.
And there's user group help for that too, by the way. So
that's right. But so what I think you want to aim for is a collaborative relationship with the DBA. And the key thing for a developer is as you start to utilize new features, for example, in PL SQL, if you start to make a lot of use of collections, or let's say the function result cache, which is a great performance optimization added in 11G, you're going to be changing how memory is utilized in the database. And if you don't go to your DBA and say, hey, this is the feature I want to use, I want to do it on these 5,000 functions, are we cool? No? Oh, why not? If you don't have the conversation, then you're just going to run into problems. And then you're going to reinforce a bias, a prejudice from the administrator's standpoint, which is that when I come to ask you for help, for like, can you please tune the database, it's not running fast enough, and the DBA says,
what did you change?
Or, tune your application first, right? I think a DBA generally says to a developer, go tune your application first. And of course, 99% of the time they're right, because we don't tune our code all that well. So as long as when you build that collaboration, then you build more trust. The administrator gets to know more about you. They might actually grant access to some of those $sign views that will help you get your job done. So that's the main message to me for just the traditional roles that we will still be playing for years to come. Work collaboratively with everybody, especially your administrator.
Well, and I think what you're talking about, and I think that's a future webcast that we're doing too on some of the function results and
that's right.
cache.
Result cache, yeah.
And know that DBAs are always asking for more memory and more storage. So if you have reasons on the database side that you want to use more memory, it supports them in getting the environments that you want. So there is some collaborative effort there to actually get some nice.
Right, so in other words,
bigger machines, more memory, life is good.
They should look through the feature set and say, which one of these things need memory?
Exactly.
And then send out an email to all the developers saying, you should look into these features. These are really good features. Oh, interesting.
So there are ways to get along really well. So, I do think some of that is changing with some of the things that you're talking about. Even if DBAs are looking for different areas to get involved and, always already familiar with SQL and PL SQL, there's some great opportunities to even go to the development side.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think a lot of developers actually a lot of administrators, when it gets right down to it, have a lot of development experience one way or the other, either by looking at their developer's code and saying, you need to work on this, or building their own scripts and so on. So yeah, having that crossover capability will only strengthen their opportunities in the marketplace. Yeah. And then, of course, there's just the new technology in the database like JSON. JSON's really hot. JSON is the new XML. It's like, how is it different from XML? It's not as verbose. It's got squiggles. Well, that's the main thing. It's not modern if it doesn't have squiggles. I mean, we should get squiggles into PL SQL somehow.
Yeah, sure the squiggles reminds me of bacon.
Yeah. Squiggles remind you of bacon?
Well,
gosh, it's got bacon on.
You brought it up long before.
I did. So, we support JSON in the database. If you've got, so here's the message to the database developers and the DBAs. If you've got JavaScript developers saying, we can't use Oracle database, we need to go to whatever other document database because we need to do document processing with JSON. It's like, no, we just installed 12.1, a couple of months ago. Yeah. You have full JSON capabilities. In fact, embedded into SQL, you can do SQL operations on your JSON documents. Look at how much cooler this is. And I think that's, again, the kind of incremental education, keeping up with the current features of the database, partly as a sell to those externalized developers to say, look at what we can do for you.
Yeah. And I think we all love new features, so that's great. I've been told that it's quarter till, which means we have time for questions from our audience.
Excellent.
Right?
And we have questions?
We have questions. Thank you both for the conversation. We have some questions from our audience that I'd like to share at this point. And I think that we should begin to phrase everything in terms of bacon flavored or how you receive bacon.
No, bacon flavored is not good. Real bacon. There you go.
Always real bacon. So the first question that we've received is, how would you rate frameworks like ADF and Apex for leveraging the knowledge you already have about databases to build applications? And Michelle, maybe we'll start with you.
Oh, I don't know if I mean, it was a real easy switch from a DBA actually to learn Apex because I did the data structures and was able to develop code off of that really easily. Didn't have to know the front end type of design stuff and able to use that real quick because of the framework. So I know you have experience with that now too.
Sure. Well, I think that it's always been about rapid application development. Everybody loves to do things rapidly. And if you're looking at an application that's data-centric, that involves lots of different tables and interactions between tables, and there's a solid normalized relational model in place, it's hard to beat a product like Apex. I don't know ADF as well because I'm not a Java programmer. It seems very powerful. My impression is that it's generally a bit more complicated to use. It's hard to ramp up as quickly as you can with Apex, but it probably depends on which language you know. So I can only really talk about Apex here. But there's no question that if you already have a team that's solidly grounded in SQL and PL SQL, and you need to start producing websites, for example, intranet websites, not even public-facing stuff, the speed at which you can produce things and maintain things and enhance things in Apex is Application Express. It's really hard to match. One of my team members, Dan McGann, is an expert in Apex and also an expert in JavaScript. His actual role on my team is to evangelize around Oracle and JavaScript, the Node.js database and so forth, driver for the database. So he'll work on Apex projects, he'll work on JavaScript projects, and when he works on a JavaScript project, he's just like, oh my God, it takes so long to do anything. In Apex, it's so fast, it's all built in. So Application Express is an incredibly successful tool. It was one of those sort of guerrilla models where it was just picked up by people from, it was built from the bottom up in terms of the user community, and the community is incredibly engaged with the development team and so on. Can't say enough about it. And for me as a PL SQL developer, I can build websites?
Yeah.
This is really great.
Very dangerous.
And it is dangerous, no question. I built a website called the PL SQL Challenge. You can take weekly quizzes on SQL and PL SQL. You should check it out.
Yeah.
I wrote that, a lot of the back end, and several other people, including my son, wrote a lot of the front end. Yes, we are dangerous. It's true.
Yes, that is dangerous.
I should not be trusted with a production application.
And actually, you're talking about all the changes. Apex, I see changing a lot faster because it does provide the mobile apps.
Right.
And it gets those frameworks available to you to be more customer-facing or...
Yeah, so Apex 5 was a major, major step forward, both in terms of the development productivity internally and the ability to make it a responsive theme and so on. So Apex is going great guns. It's been growing rapidly in terms of the user community. Inside Oracle, there are thousands of Apex applications up and running and growing daily. And I think it will have a very strong future. But I think it will always be somewhat of a niche product. It's never, you're not competing head-on with, say, a JavaScript kind of environment. Now there's a new product from Oracle called Oracle Jet, and it's a JavaScript-based framework that people inside Oracle have put together to help build JavaScript-based applications more quickly. And I believe they're also looking at adding some application builder features that would give it some of the flavor of an Apex app in terms of being smart about the tables and building components around those tables.
Now see, that's the thing that DBAs like to hear, smart about the tables.
Smart about the tables.
And smart about the data, right?
Yeah.
Steven, you mentioned in talking about Apex that this is a logical choice for people who have database development experience, and that JavaScript requires a little bit more time to ramp up, and then the Jet platform. Are there any other platforms out there that you would recommend for people who already have development experience in the database, or platforms that you think that people should dedicate time to learning that might not be as easy? I'm sorry, frameworks.
Right. Well, certainly in terms of frameworks, in JavaScript, there's a new framework every week with stranger and stranger names, so you just do with that what you need to. In terms of the back-end development, I know that there are some other products out there. I think there's a product called FormSpider or Spider that is an Apex-like tool. So I think there are other frameworks that are both commercially available, and also I've met at least 3 or 4 development teams who have built their own Apex essentially. And this is, before Apex had gotten started. They sat down and thought, we've got all these tables. If you really invest a lot of time in designing your database, there's an incredible wealth of knowledge, of information there about what your application needs to do. If you've got a foreign key on a table, if you've got constraints and so on and so forth, that's knowledge about how the application needs to work. And so if you can leverage that and generate code on top of it, you have a big leg up. So I know there's a company in Portugal that built this incredible framework for website generation on top of Oracle databases, but it's not a commercial thing particularly. So right off the top of my head, no, I don't have any particular recommendations, and I don't, I'm busy enough just focusing on staying on top of the Oracle-related technology.
Well, and I think you mentioned something too, that you even analytics is something that is really big to dig into, not just in the data and knowing the company and all the business intelligence that you can glean from that, but to pull it back to my security world, the analytics on the security is really a big thing, because you're trying to find those outliers, things that are not normal,
right,
and all the analytics that you can do. So not only the business intelligence side, but the security with all the logs and information that's coming in from there. So if you can learn more about even tools in that development that you already know,
sure,
that would be.
No, I have no doubt. I mean, as a database developer, if you're not comfortable with analytics and using things like lag and lead and partition and windowing clauses, you should learn that. That's probably one of your most important priorities going forward. You'll be amazed at what you can do. And again, we're coming up with a set of videos that will, I think, introduce it in a very simple way, and others have done so as well.
Great. You mentioned JSON earlier in 12.1, and we've got an audience question that is JSON included in 12.1, and can you store the JSON document in the database? So it sounds like people are a little bit unclear about JSON and new features in the database.
Yeah, so JSON is available in 12.1 in the SQL language. It's stored in a club. And of course, you could always do that.
Well, yeah, we actually did that in 11.2.4. We had a package in the database that did JSON and generated that for us too. So you could steal it. Oh no, you can reuse code.
So there have been a number of, like, Apex has a package called Apex JSON. So if you're doing Apex development, you could be doing JSON manipulation already, even before 12.1, I believe.
Yeah.
And there's a PL JSON package externally that's available, but now it is built into SQL itself. And so it's stored as a cloud, as I understand it. It might even be stored as an XML type. I actually don't recall. But the key thing there is not how it's stored. The key thing is what you can do with it. So there are a lot of very smart features built into SQL. You can ask, for example, is it valid JSON, and let the back-end database do all the work for you. You can certainly essentially run queries against elements within the JSON document. So it's a very sophisticated implementation. And in 12.2, which you'll be seeing this year, you'll see some of those capabilities extending into PL SQL itself as well. So even today, right now, 12.1, you've got a very solid JSON implementation in the database that you can be leveraging. No need to go to a document database. If you need to persist JSON documents in a database, retrieve them out, and especially if you want to leverage SQL on top of those JSON documents, Oracle Database is there now for you.
Great. We have an additional question that came in. Why would you develop with ADF when Apex is so good?
Right tool for the job.
Yeah, it's the right tool. It's the right tool for the job, but more to the point there, it's the right tool for the right team. So if you have a team of Java developers and you want to start leveraging the database more effectively, you want to follow a rapid application development model, I would not go to that team of Java developers and say, time to learn PL SQL, and then you can write application express applications. It's not a productive way to go. You would, but to propose ADF or to propose Oracle Jet as an alternative method are very good. I would also not go, and I've heard this happen, and it just horrifies me, where management will announce to a team of PL SQL developers, they've been there for years, they have incredible deep expertise, and they'll say, we're switching you over to Java because, what Gartner said we should, or somebody said we should, or, my coworker, anyway. And suddenly these people who are doing really good work, it's not like they're not successful. It's not like their teams have not been successful. They're being told that they're going to have to drop everything they've learned to learn Java of all things, because it's not like that's an easy thing to get up to speed on, and start to build applications, maybe with ADF or maybe not, on Java. You got to look at who you've got, right? You don't fight a war with the army you got. I hate to bring in war metaphors, but there you are. So, if I'm looking at where I want to go from today to tomorrow, and everybody's doing SQL and PL SQL, and I want to start building websites really quickly, make them responsive, Apex is something you definitely want to look at. If I've got a Java team, and I want to start doing, much stronger development on top of Oracle Database, ADF is something to look at.
Who do you think is the best ally for a programmer in a company that faces a situation like that? Their company wants to shift them to Java, and they really want to maintain what they're doing in PL SQL because it's working really well for them. Who else on the team should help them make that case?
The DBAs.
The DBA says the DBA. I was actually going to say your users. So either you're successful, either you've been successful or you haven't been. And if you can't go to your manager, forget about the users for a second, if you can't go to your manager and say, why would you want to change technologies? Look at what we've accomplished. We've been on budget, we've been on time, or we've been on budget, closer to budget than everybody else, whatever the case may be. Either you can make that argument or you can't. And then on top of that, if you can go to your users and say, do you think we've been successful? Do you think that are you looking for change? Again, if they're saying, yes, we need Java applications, like, okay. I wouldn't expect my users
trouble,
to say
right?
that. Right, then it's done. But anyway, what I would do is marshal support. Either there's a story, a compelling story to stay the way things are, but also to incorporate the new technologies, or there isn't.
Well, and I threw the DBAs out there because they like new features in the database, right? So if you're doing the SQL and the PL SQL, and your allies are actually your DBAs, they're getting you more memory, and want to use some of the new features, want to be able to upgrade to 12.1, and
well, I'm sure
so you kind of have an ally there. It may not be as strong as your users or what the business is looking for.
Well, I think that's another issue for database administrators generally, is that there's been a big shift inside companies to lines of business making technology decisions. So it used to be that, when the CIO, the CEOs, whatever, vice presidents would say, I need an application built IT. Please tell me what technology, they wouldn't even say, tell me what technology to use. They'd say, give me my stuff. But now it's like line of business guys are saying, oh, they've got their 25-year-old, wunderkind in the corner who nobody at IT even has met and knows about. He's like, hey, use this, use that. And, okay, we'll do that. And they don't even talk to IT anymore.
I know.
So there are
scary, right?
massive issues around transformations around the transfer of power inside companies around technologies. And it can be scary stuff, I'm sure, on multiple levels. So the DBA, from that standpoint, may not be the strongest place to go for support, but you certainly don't want to have your DBAs saying, yeah, forget about the SQL, PL SQL, go with Java. So you consolidate all your allies.
We've got time for one more question, and there was a question on how would you compare development between Apex versus Oracle Forms, and is there something particular that would be a convincing factor to choose one over the other?
Well, I got to tell you that when I started with Oracle in 1987, I was using SQL Forms 2.3. And my life became beautiful and whole when SQL Forms 3.0 came out. It had within it this new language called PL SQL. It let you draw lines and boxes, and I think there was like one color, green. And it was great. I thought, why do users ever need anything more than this? It turns out they did. And then things got more complicated, so I became a back-end developer and didn't fuss with the user interface anymore. So it's been a long time since I've worked with Oracle Forms. Oracle Forms is still alive. They're still moving forward with it. I don't have any ongoing contact with the product managers and so on, so I don't have a good sense about the future direction of the tool. I would say that today, if you're just getting started on doing rapid application development, I think Application Express is much more of a going concern as an active growing community. So even putting aside the technology, let's say that Oracle Forms and Apex have the same number of developers, the same level of forward-going momentum internally. Externally, the community around Apex is amazing. It's probably the best user community we've ever had at Oracle. And that can make or break your success in so many ways. So for that reason alone, I think people, forget about what I say, people will gravitate into Apex because it's just this compelling, lively story being told on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and it's definitely important to have that network and community and a group around you to be able, even why we're here discussing this, right?
Right. These days, a language of technology without a strong community, it's almost like, what, are you kidding me? That doesn't work. That doesn't sound right.
Maybe also one of our allies for our companies to stay with SQL.
of the hour, so I think we've gotten to all of the attendee questions. I want to take a moment to thank Steven and Michelle for joining us here for today's session, and to all of our attendees for your participation and the excellent questions. We will be posting an archive of today's session to the IOUG and ODTUG websites for your continued viewing, or if you need to share this with a coworker. You will also be asked to take a short survey after the session to help us with future topics and to tell us what we can do to continue to support you as a user community. With that, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks everybody.